Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this digital masterclass of the International Fleet Managers Institute, the IFMI. My name is Steven Schoefs, Chief Editor of Fleet Europe, and we are really happy that you can again all join this IFMI webinar. The IFMI stands for the International Fleet Managers Institute. It is the dedicated training and expertise sharing platform for international fleet managers only. The IFMI also stimulates forward action and it triggers innovative thinking in car fleet management. Last but not least, the IFMI focuses on best practice sharing and interaction. And also in this webinar, you will have the opportunity to learn from a recognized international fleet peer. And at the end of this webinar, there is the possibility to ask your questions to our experts. And this in a lively Q&A. You can therefore use the chat function in this webinar room. First, a little explanation on the topic of today. How will WLTP impact your fleet strategy and your fleet costs? Well, WLTP stands for Worldwide Harmonized Light Vehicle Test Procedure. It's the new measuring procedure for vehicle emissions that has been put in place from September 2017 on. WLTP, as you know, is not a buzzword. It's a reality that your company has to deal with starting right now. WLTP caused official CO2 figures of all new cars to rise, possibly costing your company hundreds of euros per vehicle per year. Now, how to deal with this and which long-term strategy to adopt? Our IFMI Digital Masterclass will get you on your way. As you can see on your screen, we have today quite an engaging agenda. We have various experts that will take you through the WLTP journey. So we will start with a little explanation of what WLTP is all about, and then going into more technical insight to end, let's say, with the management aspects around WLTP and how this impacts your car policy. Just before the Q&A, we will have the vision of Verder Wort of Infor, who will share with us how he and his company are dealing with this hot pressing fleet topic. But ladies and gentlemen, let's now start, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you the first speakers of this WLTP IFMI Digital Masterclass. And these speakers are Mr. Mark Van Eck of ALD and Nicolas Michel of Arval. And if everything is okay, then Nicolas Michel of Arval should hear me and he can take this webinar floor.
Thank you very much, Steven. It's a real pleasure to present that topic to you today, and thank you again for attending. On the first slide, I will just perhaps repeat what I just presented, Steven, about short definition of what is WLTP. This is a well-known acronym today that everybody is aware of. But it stands for Worldwide Harmonized Light Vehicle Test Procedure. It's a new lab test for cars, replacing the famous NEDC, which has been designed in the 80s. So this WLTP defines a global harmonized standard for determining the level of pollutants of CO2 emissions, fuel or energy consumptions, and also electric range from light-duty vehicles, which are passenger cars and light commercial vans. But let's see on the next slide concretely how this test concretely works. So, as mentioned, it's a laboratory test designed to represent everyday driving profiles. This WLTP driving cycle is divided in 4 parts, as you can see on the first chart at the top left of the slide, with different average speeds in 3 different cycle tests which are applied depending on vehicle class defined by power rates. These 4 parts of different average speeds are a low one, a medium one, a high, and an extra high one. Each part contains a variety of driving phases, stops, accelerations, and braking phases. In these 3 different cycles or class, there is several driving tests designed to represent one more time the real-world vehicle operation on urban, extra-urban roads, motorways, and freeways. The duration of each part is fixed between classes. However, the acceleration and speed curves are shaped differently. WLTP was developed clearly with the aim of being used as a global test cycle across different world regions, so pollutants and CO2 emissions, as well as fuel consumptions values will be comparable worldwide. This is the interest of that test. However, while this WLTP has a common global score, the European Union and the other regions will apply the test in different ways depending on their road traffic laws and needs. Still and always in the spirit to fit closer to the reality, this test will occur with a few principles that you can see on the other image on the slide. I won't detail all of them because it will be too long, but basically you can think about the ignition, for example, and when the car is starting cold, as it might be for a normal driver, the gear shift and acceleration defined by regulations to enable comparison between different cars, and so on. Just to close this chapter on how WLTP works, just a few words about the emissions that the WLTP will test. We are talking about CO2, which has been already done with the NEDC, but in another way. The carbon monoxide, the hydrocarbons, the famous NOx, which will be a new values appearing with that WLTP test, and fine particles. Sorry. So we can ask what these emissions are tested. The main reason are that some of them are impacting the quality of the air that we all breathe, I'm mentioning the NOx mainly, and some other are the CO2 contributing to the global warming. This is why they are measured. So in a nutshell, WLTP will deliver these new values on car usage closer from the reality, but still not really fitting with the reality as it is a laboratory test. So why will it remain differences between lab test and world emissions? Let's see that in the next slide. Thank you, Stephen. As for example, to illustrate the differences between a laboratory test and real driving condition, the most rapid 0 to 50 kilometers per hour acceleration timing in the WLTP test is 15 seconds, while most drivers, Europe and across the world, accelerate from 0 to 50 per hour kilometers to from 5 to 10 seconds only. So that's first differences that we can find out regarding the different results that we can have. There is others for sure, as for example the tire pressure that would be absolutely fine within the laboratory test, but in the reality could be different, too low or too high. The vehicle load, thinking about towing a caravan, that won't be tested in the laboratory, but in the real driving conditions, it will have an impact clearly on the emission and the fuel consumptions. Traffic conditions, road gradients, weather conditions, and so on, are making some differences with the reality. However, a laboratory test, as the WLTP, but also the NEDC, has to follow some standardized and repeatable procedures. That's allow the emissions to different models of car to be compared to each other. And that's one of the advantages of such a procedure. Let's close this first chapter, just mentioning the RDE on the next slide, not to be confused with the WLTP. It's a test measuring the pollutants, the RDE, such as NOx, on the real driving road conditions. So it's not a laboratory. It's done down the road. RDE does not replace WLTP, but it complements it really. And the European Union is one of the first regions in the world to introduce such an on-road testing, making a major leap in the testing of car emissions. That's all for this short definition and presentation of what it is, WLTP. And it's a pleasure to me to introduce you, Mark Vanex from ILD, to talk about the transition period from NEDC to WLTP. The floor is yours, Mark.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Welcome.
Yes, the topic that I will be covering then is indeed going from NEDC to WLTP. What are the changes? So let's go to the next slide. And I think what we'll see on the next slide is the fact that the targets for the OEMs are not all the same. So some OEMs will be able to offer more models with lower CO2 than others, and there's a reason for that. If you look at the table on the bottom left of the presentation, you'll see that the manufacturers are there with their EU market share and also the average mass kilogram. That's the average weight of their vehicles. And if you look at, for example, Daimler and BMW, you'll see that the average mass of Daimler and BMW is higher than, for example, PSA vehicles and Fiat. And as a result, also their targets for 2020, 2021 are also lower for PSA and for Fiat than they are for Daimler and BMW. So this just shows some of the discrepancy between the targets for the OEMs. And it's also important to know that there's a lot at stake for these manufacturers. There are huge fines which will be applicable if they do not make these targets by the end of 2020, 2021. So let's go on to the next slide for a moment, which is about the new emission tests and standards. So what will change? So first and foremost, we'll see that the test cycle will change. Okay, so under NEDC, it's a single test cycle, and under WLTP, it's a more dynamic cycle, and more representative of real driving. But as Nicholas mentioned before, it's still done in a laboratory. So the cycle distance has also changed. That's more than doubled from 11 kilometers under NEDC to 23.25 to be precise under WLTP. Also, the average speed goes from 34 kilometers per hour to 46.5 under WLTP. And the next point is a rather important one, the influence of optional equipment. Under NEDC, the impact on CO2 and fuel performance is not considered with regards to optional equipment. With WLTP, it is. So additional features which have additional weight are taken into account, and this, of course, has an impact on the WLTP values. The cycle time also moves under NEDC from 20 minutes to 30 minutes. The driving phase is also different. Typically, there were two phases, 66% urban, 34% non-urban. And then under WLTP, there'll be 4 more dynamic phases. So 52% urban and 48% non-urban. The maximum speed has also changed somewhat from 120 kilometers to 131 kilometers per hour. And for the gear shift, the vehicles have fixed gear shift points, and under WLTP, the different gear shift points are then applicable for each vehicle. And also, in fact, the temperature, the test temperature also changes. It was at 20 to 30 degrees, and now goes to 23 degrees. And the CO2 values are then corrected to 14 degrees Celsius. So just to highlight what the changes will indeed be. Moving on to the next slide. So WLTP is then mandatory for all passenger vehicles from September of this year, and then for all new types already from September last year. But national taxations and the 2020 CO2 target as put forward by the EU of 95 grams on passenger cars and is 147 grams on the LCVs, the light commercial vehicles. But those values are based on NEDC, so there should be no real change until 2019. The graph below is just illustrative of the changes, looking at, say, a value of July 2017 to October 2017, and you'll see the NEDC correlated value, which we'll come into in the next slide, I'll explain a bit more about that, has quite a change. So we'll see that there's a difference of about, 17%, 14%, 11%, depending on the car, depending on the options, depending on what's applicable. So on that note, let's go on to the next slide. So for an undefined interim period, the WLTP values need to be converted back into an NEDC correlated figure, which will then be done using a tool called Compass. So for any given vehicle, the NEDC correlated value will be about 10% higher than NEDC. So sort of a halfway point moving towards a full WLTP value. And also, we won't have any single value anymore for each model or version. The value will indeed depend on the the options and accessories fitted onto the vehicle. An example will be a panoramic roof. So that glass roof is heavy. It's a lot of additional weight, and that will clearly affect the WLTP value. So you can imagine there's an enormous complexity in having this data, because each vehicle could be different depending on options and accessories, and that data needs to be accurate for to be put into the production systems, for example, of leasing companies who have to provide the calculations. So a big reliance on the data providers like JATO, for example. So in the interim period, where the most recent vehicles have then been done under the WLTP homologation, they will be penalized in terms of taxation. They might not be applicable in certain car policies compared with vehicles from the old NEDC models. Because right now you'll see that different manufacturers are going across the WLTP into different phases, and that makes it rather difficult to compare and to see which vehicles fit in your car policy and which ones not. But more on that a bit later on in our presentation. Let's go on to the next slide, please. This slide is just to illustrate what's been happening with CO2 emissions based on NEDC, of course, and this is data coming from ASEA. And you'll see that over the last couple of years, as technological advancements have been put forward, that the CO2 values have been coming down quite steadily and starting to level out a bit in 2017, actually. But it's just good to point out and just to reflect on this for a moment, that without diesel vehicles, the manufacturers are really going to struggle to meet their CO2 target of 95 grams by the end of 2021. So that ends my part of this presentation. And if you just go on to the next slide, please, for a moment. And then I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is Mark Becker, who will provide a more technical insight into WLTP. So Mark, I hand over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's introduce myself a little bit. So next slide, please. My name is Mark Becker. Now, this name may not ring a bell for you, but actually Becker is an important name in the automotive world, not due to myself, but due to one of my ancestors, which was honestly for Becker, and he was the inventor of the differential system. It's quite funny, but it's history. I'm research developer at Thomas More University, independent expert on engines and vehicles. I'm the only non-OEM member of the European Advisory Committee for SEE, and I have more than 20 years of experience. Next. Well, here you see the figures that we have to meet with Euro 5 and Euro 6 limits. Well, the one who is more important today is the NOx limit, which is limited by Euro 6 for 80 milligrams a kilometer, which is also important that this limit is still the same if we go from NEDC to WLTP. So there is no change on that. So that makes it also for manufacturers much more heavy, well, to just reach the target of the 80 milligrams. Okay, next slide. Now here you see the big difference between the different cycles. You see, as already mentioned, that the cycle is longer, but one of the important ones is also that the average positive acceleration is also different, and also the percentage that the engine was stopped is almost half. At NEDC we have around 24%. At WLTP it's more or less 12.5. So that means that the engine is running much longer, which also affect the emissions. Also, the fact that there is now also more decelerations, which are not that heavy, they were heavier on NEDC, makes it for regenerative braking more interesting, so that you will see with WLTP, the figures for hybrid vehicles will be more in favor than instead of NEDC. So there's a huge difference between both cycles. Next slide, please. Here you see the effect on carbon dioxide emissions. You see that we're speaking about WLTP high and WLTP low, which are two different parts of the cycle compared with NEDC. And you can see that the vehicle mass, which is also one of the most important factors on NEDC, is also affecting on the WLTP cycle, where in most cases the emissions are higher at WLTP. Next slide. Here you see the different influence of the different parts of the cycle, WLTP high and low, and where you see the amount of energy in kilowatt hours needed for the different parts of the cycle. You see that in almost all the cases, the emissions or the power demand is higher on WLTP if you compare it with NEDC. So if the vehicle has to give more power, the emissions will also go up. So that's quite logical, but you can see that the differences can be quite huge, and also the spread on the values is quite high. The dots on the ends of the lines gives you the spread, and you see that the spread, especially for WLTP high, is really huge if you compare it with NEDC. So that makes it also more difficult to estimate what will be the exact differences or the exact influence of WLTP compared with NEDC. Next slide, please. Here you see the influence of the different parts of the resistance. You got rolling resistance, you got drag and inertia, and then you see with NEDC the inertia is almost 60%, where WLTP it's around 50. So that means that with WLTP mass has an influence, but the bigger influence will come from drag. Drag is typically for, let us say, bigger vehicles with a huger frontal area, like SUVs. So SUVs will be also more affected by the differences with WLTP compared with NEDC. Next slide, please. Here you see the influence of the different parts of the cycle. Like already mentioned, you got the low, high, medium, and extra high part. If you compare that with NEDC, you got an urban and an extra urban. Now you see here that NEDC has 52.8% for the extra urban part, which is the highway, the driving at 120 kilometers an hour. Now, if you compare that with WLTP, you got the high and extra high cycle. High goes up to 120, extra high up to 130. And you see that the influence is more than 60% of the total carbon dioxide emissions. So that means that driving at highest speeds will also have a huger influence on the WLTP value. Next slide. Here you see the comparison of WLTP high and low to NEDC, and you see, for example, for a Euro 6, it will go up from WLTP high with 14%. So that means that it will have a huge effect on taxation in future. If you compare it with WLTP low, there's almost no influence. It goes from -1% up to +4%, but that's not a huge difference. So the big difference will be at the WLTP high. Now, the last column gives you an idea of the differences of a type approval NEDC test and a normal NEDC test with a non-prepared car. And then you will see that there is also huge differences possible. For example, also Euro 6, you see that there is a difference possible of 11% from the car who was tested during the test or another normal car that was tested by an NEDC cycle. So the spread in the production of different cars can also go around 10%. So it will be difficult to estimate what will be the exact influence of WLTP if you compare it with NEDC, especially in real life, where there are not specially prepared cars for the test. Next slide. Now, this is the reason why the carbon dioxide emission will be higher. You see here the red dots. These are the typical power points you need for the driving the NEDC cycle, and you see they are or almost zero, which is the point that the car was stopped, or they are relatively low, between 20 and 40 kilowatt, with on the high speed cycle a little bit going up to peaks of 60. Now, if you look to the WLTP testing, you see that it can go up to 110 kilowatts. So the peaks are really huge. That means that carbon dioxide emissions will go up, but also especially NOx emissions at that high load point will be relatively high. Next slide. Okay, I thank you for your attention, and now I'll give back the word to the next speaker, which will be Mark again, I believe, or am I wrong?
Yes, you're wrong, unfortunately. I will take the word. It's Nicolas Michel from Arval. Yes, to introduce you and to talk about how to ensure a smooth transition to WLTP. So for that, we will cover three main topics on the next slide, please, which are consumer information, car labeling, and taxation. So I will be very quick on consumer information and car labeling to spend a little more time on taxation, which I think it is a very expected topic and very important one, I think so. So regarding the consumer information, yeah, just to tell that during this period, which is transition period, it could be quite tricky or difficult to understand. The one by cost the value for the same car. So out of this risk being quite confusing and making it difficult to compare cars, the European Union pushed some very important issue and recommendation to the market. The first one is really to maintain the transparency and comparability for customer or European manufacturers. Recommend that Europe as its member stage for a one-shot introduction of the WLTP on labels and other consumer information as for 2019. Before these dates, the use of NEDC should be legally binding for labeling. Bearing in mind that in the complexity of the transition period, manufacturers from Europe consider that this one-shot change is labeling could be made from the 1st of January 2019, with for sure the exception of the end of series cars, which will continue to have the before values, keeping on the existing system. The second one is a transparency and to be as transparent as possible toward customer. And the third one is the harmonized procedures and values introduced across all Europe. That's very important to be consistent across all the countries. For the second topic of the car labeling, I won't talk about anymore because time is running, and also because this labeling is already existing. Just to be aware that all the values, CO2, NOx, and so on, will be displayed in each body shop and car dealer to give the information to all the consumers, individuals, but also companies for sure. The next topic is all about taxations. That's a very important topic. That could be complex because of the 28 different taxation rules across Europe, and because also of the regulations complexity in itself. But I will try in a nutshell, in a few bullet points to explain you what's going on. So, first of all, most of the European member states, as you are already aware, currently are applying some form of CO2 tax on the registration and or the ownership of the car. Second point, these taxes are based on the CO2 values issued previously by NEDC and tomorrow by WLTP. Third point, European regulator announced that the move of the new WLTP test should not negatively impact vehicle taxation. Let's see what will happen But as WLTP will result in higher gram per kilometer CO2 values compared to NEDC, simply because it's more rigorous than this old test, and as we are, for instance, no clue or a lot of uncertainty around the capacity of national governments to adapt their taxation systems, let's see and wait, see what will happen. I would like also to mention that for your information, the total amount of car tax in Europe is close to 423 billion euro. And so that represents a quite very significant amount of funding sources for the states. So I presume that the governments will continue to monitor with caution this funding source, taking also in account that they have to handle policy to maintain the competitiveness of European companies toward the rest of the world. So it's definitely a tricky subject, and I'm personally afraid that some additional charges will have to be supported by the European companies for a certain period of time. The shortest and the lowest, for sure, will be the best. Having said that, we have also to bear in mind that in the same period of time, the European Union has set a challenging target to the OEM, where these have to have in 2020 or 2021, I don't remember, to reduce their CO2 emission for deliveries to 95 grams per kilometer in average based on the NEDC protocol. This will be for sure an impact, a positive impact for the final consumer and for the car taxations. But the question that everybody is asking for is that will WLTP will affect the car tax I pay? So I will try to answer that question on the next slide. And for that, I just took one concrete example of a real running fleet of 400 vehicles distributed in 6 European countries, with an average 100 deliveries per year, and with an average total rental of 600 euro per month and per car. So you can see on that table that taking the assumptions of the CO2 emission increase of 10% or 15% or 30%, the impact on the yearly budget could be from 0 to 8% per year, depending on the countries, depending on the taxation rules, depending also effectively of this hypothesis of the increasing of the CO2 emission. If roughly we are calculating an average over these 6 countries, here Belgium, Germany, Portugal, Spain, France, and UK, the impact could be from 0.5% to 3%, consolidating the data and the taxation charge, additional taxation charge that will be handled over these 6 countries. So 8%, I think it's, if we take the example of France, where there is only one car, it's a very significant impact, but in average, 3% could be manageable. One more time, this calculation has been done with the current taxation rules, which is live today. Just to mention around this taxation issue, that the countries that might be the most impacted by the new values issued by WLTP are the Nordics countries, namely Finland, Norway, and Denmark, France also, and the Netherlands. So that's all I can tell you about these tax issues and amounts and around this transition period. And it's a pleasure again to give the floor to Mark Van Eyck from ILD.
All right, thank you, Nicholas. So the next topic which we'd like to address is then what could be the impact on the car policy? And for that, just ask we go to the next slide. So what is the possible impact on a car policy? Well, first of all, the availability of WLTP information is quite challenging at this point in time. OEMs are doing the testing in different phases. Some are further than others with regards to WLTP. And then, of course, all that information also needs to go to the data consolidators, data providers like JATO, who then in turn provide that data to the leasing providers, for example. So ideally, you'd like to be able to compare the NEDC correlated value, and of course WLTP. But just simply the availability of the information is, well, not easy. So all new cars must be tested according to WLTP testing method and no longer on the NEDC from September 2018. We know WLTP has been adopted at EU level, and vehicle-related taxation is determined at a country level. So the countries will move at different paces to make the adjustments for WLTP, and therefore we won't have a single switchover period for that. So vehicles could certainly be negatively impacted in the current car policy, for car policies with the CO2 cap, that is. Vehicles which were in that car policy before might not fit anymore. And also, even if adjustments are made, the impact of extra options and accessories will also maybe result in those vehicles no longer being made available. So drivers will not be able to order similar vehicles. That's a very real scenario. And as shown by Nicholas, indeed, a cost increase will take place on the vehicles, especially in markets with a high CO2 linked taxation. So the impact will be quite notable there. So from the 1st of January, as you mentioned, the national governments should adjust the vehicle taxation and fiscal incentives according to WLTP values, but respecting the principle that WLTP should not have a negative impact on the consumer. How exactly this will happen, this still remains to be seen. So WLTP has been adopted at EU level, and at a vehicle-related taxation is determined at the country level. Therefore, the countries will need to respond accordingly. But as I mentioned as well, the response will not always be aligned and won't be forthcoming at the same time. And either way, we know that taxation is very likely to increase, as governments will almost certainly use this as an opportunity to increase their taxable revenue stream. So clearly, more information is needed. Therefore, leasing companies will continue to be in close contact with the OEMs and companies such as JATO, which provide the vehicle data to the leasing providers to enter into their quoting or production systems. And all OEMs target to be live by September 2018. And in fact, they have no alternative, as this is very much a legal requirement. So let's move on to the next slide. So still, what could be the impact on your car policy with regards to managing orders and deliveries? And in this regard, then there are a couple of scenarios. One could be to anticipate the renewals, looking at your vehicles coming up for renewal, which ones are renewed within the next couple of months between now and the end of the year. Another one could then be to possibly freeze orders until more information becomes available, because that is one of the main challenges, the lack of sufficient information to be able to act on that. One could also anticipate with some early terminations to avoid additional costs linked to the increase of CO2 values. Or one could also define alternative powertrain scenarios to alleviate the WLTP impact. In other words, introducing possibly more hybrid vehicles or electric vehicles to alleviate the impact. Or a solution could in fact be a combination of the above points. So as we mentioned before, as there is insufficient information at this moment in time, the suggestion is pretty much to wait with updating any CO2 related car policy limit until there's more clarity on the actual cost impact. And this will take until possibly the end of Q3, when all new vehicles have been tested on the base of WLTP. And only then can the exact pricing impact on new lease rates become clear. Therefore, we're all pretty much, I suppose, in a bit of a waiting phase as more information needs to become available. And needless to say, your suppliers will keep you informed of any new developments in this area. Well, that is as soon as it becomes available. Therefore, stay tuned to any changes on a national or international level. And it's also, I think, quite important to raise awareness with your internal stakeholders about the possible impact of WLTP for your organization. So this concludes my part of the presentation. And I will now like to introduce the next speaker to you, which is then Fer de Woort of Infor, and he'll give you the view of a fleet customer. So over to you, Fer.
Thank you, Mark. Let me introduce myself and my company very quickly. Infor is one of the largest enterprise software companies worldwide, with over 90,000 customers, 15,000 plus employees. I'm responsible for the European fleet with a size of 1,000 vehicles, spread over 15 countries in Europe, where we have one car policy in place and using one manufacturer to support us for all vehicles through Europe. Next slide, please. I briefly want to touch touch base on what we are doing, our current car scheme, what we do know, and the next steps. The graph showing is in principle visual what will happen with the CO2 emissions over the next 6-7 months. Next slide, please. The current car scheme we have is that we are business usual ordering vehicles which are available by the manufacturer at the moment. Important is that this car needs to be registered before the 1st of September 2018 to avoid any impact on the WLTP or increases. After week 28, we are considering an order stop. That's also the period that the majority of the manufacturers in the past introduced the model year 2019. This week is also announced by the manufacturer, so this is a consideration we are taking into attention at the moment. The ordering means at the moment the availability of the cars we are offering to our staff. We've got a limited car choice. We noticed and notified that due to the real drive emission test applicable at the moment, that several cars with smaller engines like 1000 cc, 1.2, 1.4 TDIs, 1.6 TDIs, 1.5 engines are taken out of production. That means that roughly 20% of the vehicles we are offering are taken out of production at this point of time. What we also have in the current car scheme is that all cars which are now running and registered are not impacted in any way. That means no cost changes due to taxation or whatever, as the cars have got the registration based on the current CVO or registration document. The main problem we are facing at the moment is that the information we are trying to retrieve from the manufacturers is quite low, marginal. That means when cars are taken out of production, when are they coming back in production? We are confronted with facts that cars are taken out, but no new information when cars will be available again. This makes it a bit complicated. Next slide, please. What we do know is that the CO2 change, the WLTP test, will impact the CO2 emission, which also impact expenses in several countries. We are providing a fleet. Briefly, is very simple. The dates mentioned in the previous presentations is 1st of September 2018, change from NEDC to NEDC correlated, and the 1st of January 2019, where we know that the estimated overall increase is estimated between 20 and 25% of the current CO2 values. To make sure that we are getting or receiving our cars, we are discussing price guarantees for cars we are ordering at the moment. In some countries, the importers for the specific country guarantee the price as long as the cars are registered before the 1st of January 2019. What we also know is that options, touch base briefly, and the sunroof, but even a spare wheel or other slide options, tow bars, for example, will increase the weight of the vehicle, which means also that it will increase pricing after September 1st of 2019. This can mean that we can consider to downsize vehicles, but that's not applicable, not preferred solution. What we also do know is that fuel is not impacted. We in our company are budgeting on our real expenses. We also noticed in the past when taking the brochure of the vehicle that the fuel consumption in reality was quite different compared to what is mentioned in the brochure. So we're budgeting our fuel expenses on the real expenses. So this is not affecting anything, any item in our financials. What we also do know is that when the WLTP will be effective, it will also increase the purchase price of the vehicles, which means the benefit in kind for our staff is also increasing. This is the thing we're trying to avoid, and with the slow information or the lack of information receiving from the manufacturers, it's a consideration that we say, let's have an order stop. In general, it's the situation creates a lot of uncertainties for everyone until the 1st of January 2019. Hopefully, we will get the information quicker that we can anticipate into the next years to make sure that we can provide still the same vehicles we're offering at this point of time. Next slide, please. The next steps we are considering is, just mentioned, we will postpone ordering after week 28. That's in the countries where we don't get a price guarantee offered by the importer. To make sure that our employees and our staff eligible for a vehicle can keep driving, is we will extend current leases, or we provide long-term rentals. Those cars are already registered, so no impact in NDC, and the CA is the item for the rental company, unless they are raising their rates starting beginning of next year. The countries where the impact will be significant, just mentioned already the Nordics, we've got a fleet there, the Netherlands and France. We will consider to see if we can find an additional scheme to avoid any raises in financials, but also any raises for the benefit in kind for our employees. As soon as the information is available from the manufacturers, we will rewrite our current car policy and implement it in Q1 or Q2 2019. Until that, there's no change, as the impact, or the real impact, is not known. There can be vehicles which have got now a higher CO2 emission, but pretty correlated, or even when the newer engines are coming, the CO2 emission may be less than the NEDC value. We don't know. The fuel expenses, just briefly mentioned, we are budgeting in real expenses, so the fuel choice is not changing at this point of time. We all know that the fuel prices are raising due to the oil price, which is raising. The dollar value per barrel is getting higher, but that's that's a side effect. And last but not least is the limitations of car choice. We will limit furthermore options to make sure that when cars coming available, we can redeploy them very simple into our car scheme, but also to other staff. This is a very short explanation, which gives you an insight about what we are trying to do for the upcoming period to avoid any cost raising, but also to make sure that we've got a right portfolio of cars to provide it to our staff. Thank you for your attention, and in case you've got questions, please raise them.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fer, for your explanation. We have now come to the final session of this IFMI Digital Masterclass with a little Q&A together with our experts. You see them here on the screen: Marc van Eck, Nicolas Michel, Marc Pecker, and Fer de Wort. So if you have a question, please send it via the chat function so that we can also have your question in this little Q&A. And gentlemen, experts, there are already some questions that were sent. So let's start. Perhaps the first one for Mr. Marc Pecker of Thomas More. Mark, do you think, with the knowledge and expertise that you have, that WLTP is a good measurement? Or is there, for example, a risk that in a few years' time we move to a new system again?
Well, if I see that with WLTP the figures are much more realistic, on the other hand, there is a push that will go to the industrial world. I mean that for trucks, the emissions is given in grams a kilowatt hour an engine, and that's also an idea that lives, because even now, if you have a car with an engine of 200 kilowatts, you will only use, let us say, around 100 of it, and you don't get the real emission at 200 kilowatts. Now, truck engines are tested to the full limit with their full power, and then if you go compare passenger cars like trucks, you will have an even better figures for reality. So yes, I believe that this is only a step in between. Okay.
A question for Fer de Wort. And I can imagine that many fleet managers in this room will have thought about that when you presented a little bit your fleet structure at the moment. In fact, you are working with one car manufacturer throughout Europe. Now, could WLTP, or better the consequences of WLTP, lead, let's say, to open up your car policy to other car manufacturers or multiple car manufacturers to spread the risk?
Yes, this is a possibility we will definitely consider. But keep in mind that all manufacturers are struggling at the moment with the same issue, with the higher CO2 emissions due to the WLTP. For us, it's important that they can develop a powertrain matching an engine with a gearbox that will meet the criteria also with 2021, the 95 grams, but also not get an increase in our expenses we are budgeting at the moment. So we will decide further when there's more information available. But the outcome today is, with the information we have, we will stick to the scheme we are using. But definitely, when there are other better solutions, we will definitely consider that.
Okay. A question for Mark Van Eck of ALD. Mark, with still so many uncertainties, and you mentioned already a few, and also your colleague Nicolas Michel of Arval mentioned them, do you think that it's possible for corporate fleet managers to estimate the consequences of WLTP already today?
Stefan, that's a very, very difficult question at this point in time. I think if there's one of the few key elements which has come through the presentations by the various speakers today, is that there is indeed so much uncertainty, and that is due to the lack of information, which makes it very difficult to act on and to make the relevant cost estimations to see, well, what is the actual impact on your fleet? What can you expect for next year, for the years going forward? It's just too difficult to answer that question with the lack of information at this point in time. And I can imagine that once that information does become available, everybody will be able to move quickly and will have to do so as well. But at this point, it is just very, very difficult.
I'm moving forward to your colleague Nicolas Michel of Arval, and I'm going to try it again with him in a slightly other way. Mr. Michel, how would you recommend to track, let's say, the CO2 emission progress, as today, and you have mentioned it, none of, let's say, the suppliers, the car manufacturers, the data suppliers can truly identify WLTP tested vehicles. So if fleet managers would like somehow to, let's say, verify the progress in what's happening in terms of CO2 evolution, what is your recommendation for them?
Well, very good question, but in fact, to prepare the arrival of WLTP and to anticipate this new CO2 value, my first message would be don't panic. It's not a revolution, it's just an evolution of a laboratory homologation process. The cars still will running, will still be delivered by manufacturers, and will continue to work as before. That's my first comment. Second comment is that for any change or evolution, we need to adapt ourselves, that's for sure. So typically for fleet customer, the impact of WLTP may have collateral on the company car policy, which will have to be amended, as mentioned by Per in this presentation. For me, considering three major angles. First one is the driver satisfaction. The second one, the vehicle TCO approach, integrating right now all the charges and also real fuel consumption cost. The third one might be the CSR concern. So concretely, it means that the car list in the car policy will have to be probably enhanced, integrating more and more alternative powertrains energy to diesel and petrol, such as electric cars, hybrid cars, and so on. The CO2 caps within this car policy should be probably fine-tuned in the coming months, and there are if there are any defined within this car policy for sure. And maybe the last point is that they have to anticipate probably a budget revision, a yearly budget revision, due to the tax impact of these new CO2 values. But as well, and as mentioned by my colleague, effectively a lot of uncertainty. So be prepared and be ready for that change, but keep cool, don't panic.
Okay, thank you. A few questions for our professor, Marc Pecker. The first one, we are talking about WLTP, but what is happening, let's say, in other parts of the world related to this topic? For example, in Africa, in the US, in China?
Well, in Africa, there is absolutely nothing. In US, they are focusing more on real driving emissions. So they have their FTP 75, which is a little bit comparable with WLTP, but they are focusing quite hard on real driving emissions. So in US, it's possible that they just choose a car, they test it, and when they don't comply with the regulation, there is immediately a fine, and the fine will be paid by who's responsible. First of all, the driver will be that. If the driver can prove that they do everything possible and everything is done by the book, then they go to the people who did the maintenance. Mm-hmm. If the maintenance was done correctly by the book, then it goes to the manufacturer. So that's actually the way US is looking to it. China, for the moment, they are speeding up quite rapidly. They're reducing their emissions quite heavily, and they have a totally different strategy. For example, manufacturers in China, they get a penalty if they sell an internal combustion engine car, and they get a kind of financial award when they're selling an electric one. So they're pushing very, very hard on the electric side.
Okay, do you foresee with the introduction of WLTP here in Europe that there might be also more on a global level a certain convergence or not?
What do you mean?
That perhaps, yes, that perhaps the different systems that are applied throughout the continents, can it be that in the near future they can become more harmonized and become a little bit closer to each other, or is this not on the agenda, you think?
Well, it's not immediately on the agenda, but with WLTP, which is comparable with FTP 75 in US, there is already some comparability possible. And also China is using a lot of similar things like EU. Just for all the attendees, you have to look to the website of Delphi, and they have a leaflet which is called the Delphi Emission Standards, and there you can find all the information of which standard is applicable in which part of the world.
Okay. Another question is related to the 95 grams of CO2 that Europe is putting forward for 2021. And the question is quite straightforward. As probably that target of 95 grams has been put in place based on NEDC, what is your expectation to such a value on WLTP?
Well, if you see that for, let us say, there's now a huge difference for relatively small cars. If you compare NEDC with WLTP, for the bigger ones, the difference is not that significant, but it will certainly have an impact, and you have to calculate an impact between, let us say, 3 and 10% that carbon dioxide emissions will rise. So it will be very, very hard for manufacturers with the shift we're making now in Europe from diesel to gasoline. It will be very difficult for them to reach the 95 grams target.
Okay. A question for Ver de Hoort. Ver, with WLTP and all the issues and questions that might raise from this topic, do you think that it could accelerate the adoption of alternative powertrain vehicles in your fleet and in fleets of your peers, the fleet customers?
Yes, definitely. We were already planning to add or to switch. That has to do with the previous announced diesel bans in Germany, for example, or the combustion engine ban in which is announced for Paris in 2023. So we were together also with the changing environment, so regardless of the NEDC to WLTP, this was already scheduled. The only issue we are facing is when you are using a cost-driven car policy, it's difficult to add an electrical vehicle or the plug-in hybrid vehicles into that scheme, as those cars are not the best cost efficiency in the past. That's proven. But I think with also that the manufacturers have to reach the 95 grams on NEDC with the loss of diesel cars, that the development on electrical vehicles will go in a very quick, in a very short period of time. And what was scheduled for 2020 to be available, the rumors are now coming that several manufacturers are coming with cars which are available by the end of this year, but also mid in 2019. Mm-hmm. We embrace those initiatives, and when they are able to fit cost-wise into our scheme, they will add it immediately.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentlemen, experts, thank you for your insights. We have to close the webinar here. So I would like to thank all of you for participating in this webinar. You can see on the screen that we will have 2 more IFMI Masterclasses this year. The first one is a new webinar on the 27th of September. It's about electrifying your fleet. And on the 27th of November, there is a full-day training session in Barcelona, in which we will discuss how to prepare your fleet and mobility for today, tomorrow, and the future. So thank you very much to everyone. I think it was a great webinar. I would like to thank also our IFMI partners, and I hope to meet with you in our next digital masterclass. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.